Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending our inaugural professorial lecture. Thank you. We're not expecting any fire alarms, so if there is one, it's real. There's 3 fire exits, one behind you, one to your right, and one to your left. If you can please calmly follow our Vice-Chancellor to the car park 2, adjacent to the Catalyst building, and that's where our assembly point will be. So without further ado, Professor Martin Jones, Vice-Chancellor, who will introduce Annabelle.
You follow me in the event of a fire, I'll be first out. I'm just a warm-up person, Annabelle. Don't look so... Can I welcome you all this evening to the Professorial Inaugural Lecture of Professor Annabelle Kiernan. Annabelle joined Staffordshire University as Pro Vice-Chancellor in May 2021. Of course, was confirmed as Professor on the 7th of June last year of the Professorial Conferment Committee, which I have the pleasure of chairing. Referees and assessors reports are taken, and there was a really strong support for the award of the grade and title of Professor. As you'll hear this evening, and Annabelle, I'm trying to not sound like Melvin Bragg at this point, as you'll hear this evening, Annabelle has made it through her career mission to improve access and inclusion to higher education, to promote innovative teaching practices, and always, I think, to strive for excellence in terms of the promotion of student experience that runs through your work, Annabelle. Annabelle, or Professor Kiernan, as we should call her today, to be correct, has helped raise the profile of Staffordshire University nationally, I think internationally through work streams, working with the Purpose Coalition, which is Justin Greening, working with Million Plus, the mission group that I'm on the executive of, and of course Universities UK, Res Publica, the think tank, Department for Education, and is a regular speaker at national events on skills and lifelong learning. Here at Staffordshire University, we know Annabelle for the roles that she's played in micro-credentials, bite-sized units of learning, accessed by people of all ages to fit around their busy lives and their careers, to help them upskill and have personal development. As part of her remit to refresh the university academic strategy, Annabelle is also responsible for positioning the Staffordshire Centre for Learning and Pedagogic Practice, SCOPE as we know it, influencing the sector in terms of standards in learning and teaching, but also the important role in terms of winning some quite considerable research grants under your sponsorship, Annabelle. Annabelle has a PhD in policy making theory from the University of Warwick. I've read your PhD. It's not too similar from my own position on state theory, and has extensive experience of higher education, having previously worked at Nottingham Trent University as Deputy Dean of the School of Social Sciences. Prior to that, of course, you were Head of Education at Faculty of Arts and Humanities at Manchester Metropolitan University, where you also, I don't know how you found time for this, you were Director of the Centre for the Study of Football and its communities. Annabelle started her life out at the University of Manchester in the late 1980s, and I think you might have been in the same first-year class as myself, because we're contemporaries at Manchester. We were talking earlier about the Stone Roses, about the late Derek Draper, and about some of the great political things that went on at the same time I was at Manchester University as you. Also, you've held posts at Sheffield Hallam University, University of West Scotland, that was Paisley at the time, where you were the Jean Monnet Chair of European Integration and Public Policy, an incredible achievement for that stage of your career. Annabelle is well-travelled, experienced, and the inaugural lecture this evening is part of her rites of passage as being a professor. Ladies and gentlemen, can I welcome Annabelle Kiernan, Professor, to the stage. Thank you. Not walk off your notes, you see.
No, don't do that. Thank you very much, Martin. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming along. Most people who've seen me in the last few days will know that, you know, I was encouraging people not to come, just because it's an odd thing. I had my first job in 1994 as a part-time lecturer, so this is 30 years now in the sector, which feels an awfully long time. And I suppose this lecture this evening will be a meander, really, through my life and career, and the purpose of which, really, I think, is insight into my approach to education, and the lens through which I see the opportunity and challenges of higher education. I thought I'd start with an old school report. This is from when I was about 14, and people who work with me and people who know me may recognise at 14. Annabelle has a strong personality and is not influenced by her fellow students, still remains true. But I'd like to just add the bit that she is pleasant, polite and cooperative. And I hope that throughout my career and working, I'm so glad to see so many from my teams here this evening, that still remains true. I think I've said in the brochure that there's a lot of talk in the sector often about first in family. People who are the first generation to access university and higher level learning. Unusually, I'm seventh, and I think that really is unusual for somebody in my generation. I didn't know my paternal grandparents, but on my mum's side, I was in the orbit of my maternal grandparents, and my grandfather was a miner, and my grandmother raised a family, and they had 6 children, and the eldest of those was my mum. And all 6 children went to university. And this was a time when really still only about 10% of the population went and accessed higher learning or university study. So it was something of an achievement, I think, and it's something that stayed with me. So my grandparents both left school at 14, but despite that, recognised the real social and economic mobility that came through education and that horizon opening and the ability for it to bring forward opportunities that they knew were needed for the next generations of children. So although I was born in Hull, the family moved to the West Midlands, and in fact, now this is where the family album starts. Apologies all. But so I was brought up in the West Midlands in a new town of what then was Telford New Town. It was a town built in the 1950s, and it was about what could be in terms of people moving out of cities and into I think what was described as the glorious countryside of England. So it was purpose-built. But actually really what it was in the end, and certainly by the time I was growing up there as a child, it really was housing for displaced communities of different types, dislocated people from deindustrialised areas of England and Scotland primarily. So this was a place that had lots of Scots, which my grandfather was, Geordies, Cockneys, and then where my grandmother's main home was, we had Czechs and Italians and Poles. And so it was the kind of area that had different communities with different needs, all placed together and looking forward to what kind of opportunities you get from being in a new town. But in the 1970s, the economic environment, some of this may start to sound familiar, was very challenging. Lots of people were out of work, and there was a lack of services, particularly in those kinds of local communities that I'm referring to. And actually, there wasn't very much to do, particularly for the youth and teenagers, other than maybe go to the precinct or knock about in the spaces between what was quite interesting housing. You can see a picture of it there. So the politics of the time were also quite activist, for those of you who may remember, particularly in the area of things to do with individual rights and equalities. So those kinds of movements, feminism, anti-racism, and inclusive movements, which were politically and socially active in that period. And many of those remain, I think, unresolved. But that was the context in which I grew up. And so what you can see here, not only was the economic environment challenging, one might say that the fashion environment and the hairdo environment was similarly challenging. But that's me in Hull as a baby on the second top. And that's my parents, both with long hair, in the 70s in Sutton Hill. And then the one with the wall is my mum with 3 of her brothers and sisters and me in what was Sutton Hill. And I went back, actually, not that long ago. And honestly, it looks quite the same. And that tells you an awful lot, I think, about the investment and the ability of local authorities and local councils to do what is needed by people in those kinds of housing spaces. But I liked it. I enjoyed growing up there, and it was really interesting in terms of the time. So in terms of the cultural change, again, in the 1970s, as I said, there were a lot of teenagers, young people, particularly where we were in Sutton Hill, in Telford and in Madeley. And there were at that time also clearly lots of youth subcultures, many of which actually were bound up with the kind of politics which I've referred to. So again, feminism, women's rights, anti-racism, and women's refuges from domestic violence. And also this was reflected in the music of both punk and ska. And that was something also that I grew up around in terms of the popular culture. And certainly, if anybody knows their 1970s local history, Coventry, Birmingham, Wolverhampton, and in fact, I think, Martin, you found the Sham played in Hanley in the same period as advertised in this fanzine. So in terms of the cultural mix, this is the space in which I grew up. And what you have across the top there in terms of the photographs is a fanzine that my parents started in order to have something to work with the youth, the forgotten voices of teenagers, all the things I said about having very little to do. And there was a youth club, St. Mick's, and the mix of music and politics in that space, as articulated through this fanzine Gutter Snipe, was very significant. And it was supported by the Telford Community Arts at the time through the community print shop, so friends of my parents who actually did the printing. There was a lot of screen printing at the time and, you know, innovative ways of putting together fanzines. And it was very much about the music, but it was also, like I said, about the politics. And so I grew up in that kind of cultural politics and therefore also the politics of protest and the politics of activism. I was taken on protests. I was on a number of floats in May Day parades for a variety of causes, and I was surrounded by punks and the ska movement. So therefore, I think that I was also brought up with purpose. That's what it gave me. And I should say, so that photograph on, of the two people reading Gutter Snipe, that's actually The Damned. That's Rat Scabies and Captain Sensible. Gutter Snipe is the magazine in the middle, and that's my mum, as in her scar phase at the end. But it was important for me in terms of, I think, two driving features. And as I said, the Youth Centre St Mick's in Madeley, it became the centrepiece and the outlet for youth, and I think it attracted young people from further afield than just the town in which it resided. They put on bands, Mum and Dad and their friends, they put on the Specials, the Selector, Secret Affair, but also, as you can see in the top, in the biggest photograph, that's my mum's younger brother, who was also in a band and went on to be in other bands in Manchester later on. So they put on bands, they put on things to engage young people in meaningful activity, if you like, would probably be the common parlance. But it was also anti-establishment, and it was seen as such. And it, lots of the local councillors did not like it. It was considered sort of foul-mouthed. But it was challenging, and that's because of the kind of politics that it represented. And on the previous slide, if you can access it, there was actually a BBC Open Door programme. There was a series called Open Door, which was on for about 10 years through the 70s and into the 80s. And it was a platform for allowing community organisations to articulate the work that they were doing locally for communities. And there is an episode on YouTube of Gutter Snipe, which is narrated by my dad. It has my mum and my dad in it. These are stills from it at the bottom. That's my my dad, and that's my mum in the middle. And you can see that it was about alternative Telford and the two women punks, Suzanne and Alison, who I remember as a child. And what they do in that, and I would encourage people to look at it if you're interested, is talk an awful lot about both the challenges of trying to have provision for services, being able to articulate the voice of disaffected youth and be able to channel it in different creative and cultural and political ways. So really, I think I grew up with two things. One was about the importance of education, as I said, from my grandparents forward, what it could do for people and how it moved on for social mobility and economic mobility and the creation of economic opportunity. And also I grew up and carried with me a political subculture which was about capturing the voices of the excluded, amplified them, and tried to bring about change. And those two things for me remain the currents of my career in higher education. They're the two things that I still think drive me, they're the things that I'm committed to, and I hope that they're the things that people can see in the kind of work streams and strategic projects that I lead. I went to university with these two currents. There's a face I'm sure people still have seen of mine in more modern times. That's me at my graduation. I went to the University of Manchester, as Martin said, and I carried, like I said, those two currents about the importance of education and the need to be supportive of different communities and different excluded persons as I moved forward. There were big political moments when I was at university. There was the first Iraq war, there was the poll tax, and there was a big return to the movement for Reclaim the Night. And in many ways, they also defined my time at university. I probably shouldn't repeat the fact that I spent quite a lot of time sat in the road on protests. I balanced it with my academic study, but it was important for me I was studying politics, that I also did a bit of politics as well. I think also interestingly at the time at University of Manchester, our student union president was Derek Draper. If people are familiar, sadly now passed, but he was our student union president. Our local organiser was Lord Peter Mandelson back then, Mandy, and I also was in classes with Liam Byrne, who's an MP now in Birmingham, but is the one that infamously wrote the note, "There is no money left," when Labour came out of power. And so for that moment, that was the beginnings of New Labour. So to be around that, it was very intentional, it was very developed in terms of the thinking, and it was a very strong set of currents that we were involved with when I was studying at Manchester University. So I studied politics, my first degree is in politics, and like I said, I did some politics along the way, and I should say, and this is exactly what me and Martin were talking about before, this is the time of Madchester, so we had there was a good cultural moment there. We've been trading ticket stubs on stone roses and so on. And I should also say there was Manchester United, which, you know, I'll just get that in. It's important, though. It comes back. So after I did my PhD, I got my first full-time teaching job in 1995, and that was as Jean Monnet Chair of European Integration and Public Policy at what was then the University of Paisley, which is now the University of the West of Scotland, and it had been a technical college prior to that, to which I think Tony Benn was associated in its early days as the Minister for Technology. So having done my undergraduate degree in politics, and I did a master's in European Community Studies and my PhD in power and policy making. And so having been through that first testing time of being a part-time lecturer, this first full-time job as a lecturer at the University of Paisley, which is outside Glasgow in the west of Scotland, was a challenge. Paisley was a town also hollowed out by deindustrialisation, again from the mines and the shipyards, and it had pockets of absolute poverty. And it was also, therefore, a place where there were whole swathes of people looking for a new and a different start as a result of that. So the university was purposely and very self-consciously a university of social inclusion. The barriers to entry were low, and I think if we had thought about educational gain at that point, it would have been astonishing in terms of our ability to support learners through to very good outcomes. I was in my 20s, and I was teaching much older learners, and that was really challenging. So the demographic of learners, particularly I was in social sciences, politics and social sciences, was people in their 40s and 50s, like I said, that post-deindustrialisation, people out of work who wanted to return to university. And in social sciences, that was a lot of women. And it was people who had lived lives. And here was I, in my early 20s, teaching people who had full lives experience to bring into the classroom. And what that taught me really early on was that you need to think really carefully about your pedagogy, how you approach learning, teaching and assessment in order to support people to have the capacity to absorb what you're saying. And I had to think really quite hard about how do you change the classroom dynamic? How do you democratise the classroom experience? How do you facilitate people's actual lived experience as having value in their learning journey? That they don't leave that at the door, they come through the doors with it, and that you need to think of ways in which you're facilitating that lived experience to support the learning and therefore their engagement with learning and therefore, in very instrumental terms, retention and positive outcomes. So for me, it really was a challenge, right? How to do things differently. So that was about changing the way in which we taught. It was about levelling the classroom space so that we had, it wasn't me stood at the front doing this. It was about having more group work. It was about allowing people to talk about what they knew from their own lives and its relevance and its application to the kind of concepts that we were discussing. How do you design assessment so that people are getting the absolute most out of the educational opportunity that they have? And for me, that is fundamental, because if we believe in access and success of different demographics of students, different types of learners, then you have to find ways that the opportunity that is afforded through higher education is not lost or mitigated by those kinds of barriers. And that's why pedagogy is so incredibly important. How we teach, how we do, and how we respect the people that are in the classroom in terms of what they bring to the table. I was at the University of Paisley for 11.5 years, and I got my long service pen and pencil set at the end of that, which was slightly disconcerting, but that was part of the process. And I enjoyed it very much, and like I said, it was challenging, and it having come through, as Martin said, Manchester, Newcastle and Warwick, I was in a different environment with different challenges. It wasn't the student experience I had had that I now had to deliver. So University of Paisley, it was critical, I think, to shoring up those two things that I'd already was carrying with me around the transformative impact of education and carrying the sort of the culture with you. And I went from the University of Paisley to Sheffield Hallam, where I did quite a lot of work around advocacy and how do you translate that into teaching. So I went into a senior lecturer role, and that was to deliver what was then newly validated politics degrees. They had social science and they had sociology. They'd only just created a politics degree. So I was brought in to help deliver this new programme. And what was really important for me at that time at Sheffield Hallam is that they had a core of people who were absolutely driven by pedagogy, absolutely driven by learning and teaching and reflecting on your practice. And we did that through the Centre of Sociology and Politics. But I had a core of colleagues who were still across the sector who really thought it was important to have a centrality of thought around why are you doing something, how are you doing it, and how is that improving outcomes? So I had the pedagogy backup, and I also fortunately had the freedom at Sheffield Hallam to insert some new teaching, some new thinking because of these new programmes. And also there was starting to be a current of applied learning. We were starting to think more in those kinds of terms. And so that led me to offer applied politics, whatever that might mean. So one of the, again, which was quite a challenge, I had to teach politics to nurses. Linda, but, you know, to give the policy context to the ways in which decisions were being made about the NHS, which again was a challenge for me with professional people in the professions coming in to learn about politics, which wasn't their first choice. It was a requirement. But again, you needed to think about what you were doing, explain why it was important, what was relevant about it and how they could use it. I did the first online module when I was there because that was also, the new technologies were starting to come to the fore, and we did effectively our first blended learning module when I was at Sheffield Hallam. And I also did fly-in teaching in Hong Kong to public servants. And I was going in talking about political concepts, political institutions, political structures, which were not recognisable in Hong Kong. And so again, it was a challenge. How do you do it and how do you get it to stick? But it was a good challenge for me. And I moved then into, as I said, this applied politics space, because I thought that was important. And really it was about advocacy and about creating space in the curriculum to enable students to connect with politics outside the classroom. And as you can see, because the headline on the BBC, which covered it, was students learn how to protest. So this was in an era where we were just starting to talk about fees. We were starting to talk about the fact that students needed to work in order to support their studies. And effectively, I was saying, OK, there's less space or less facility for students to engage in those kinds of things which have real importance for them as they go on their journey. And so I'm going to put it in the curriculum. And so I had a community action project. They weren't allowed to occupy buildings, I'll just say that. There were some rules. But it was really about, because new social movements were, again, at the fore in that period of time. And it was trying to get young people to connect to the ideas that situate around universities, not just what's happening in the classroom. So it was covered by the BBC, it was covered by Sheffield Radio and a Sheffield local newspaper, and also by Taiwan, who thought this was terribly interesting, that we'd be teaching people to protest in the UK. So I like to think in that period, like I said, had the backing of the pedagogy, and I thought differently and I did differently, and to good effect. So I continued it. This is me at Manchester Metropolitan University, where I moved into politics and public services. And there again, I taught the first, what was then a COIL module, Collaborative Online International Learning, with a university in the United States and one in Romania, through the Atlantis project. And that was about that sort of cross-cultural understanding. I also did a lot of interdisciplinary teaching, though. And this, again, was new for me in social sciences. And again, I used the vehicle of applied learning. So I don't know whether people will remember, it was the time of the big society in the Northern Powerhouse. So there was a lot to go at there in terms of what was needed in society and how much should we provide as volunteers and citizens and how much should be provided by local government. So we did a conference on big society. There had been riots in Manchester, so that photograph on the poster where it says snapshots from the front line was actually during the riots in Manchester at that moment, where the youth were disaffected and were showing it. Other things on there, I had that interdisciplinary learning module, which was called Engaging the Humanities. Again, it was about democratising the classroom. It took students from every discipline. We merged with the School of Art, so then it was available to students in the School of Art. And I think the thing that I liked most about that teaching was I took the assessment reins off. Students were allowed to design their own assessment, as long as it was signed off by the teaching team. They could articulate what they needed to articulate in the best way that met their needs. And it threw up some incredible projects. and there's a couple of them on there. I had a flash mob on Market Street by the Greek students because they were effectively saying, well, Greek culture is treated like a service industry, but you don't actually know anything about Greek culture. So they did a flash mob. It took them ages to organise. They were out practising the dancing every week and getting all the Greek students from the different Greek societies. And they did it in Market Street in Manchester. And that is also available on YouTube, as you can see, because they were very proud of it. The dancing to Zorba the Greek. And that was their assessment. Lots of students made films about which were informed by their lived experience. And that we had a lot of racism towards black students on campus, particularly in some of the creative arts disciplines. And it was very overt. People would get in and out of lifts. People would write on registers abusive things under people's names. So we had a lot of students. I had one young female student who dressed in different versions of the hijab, went and filmed herself in Manchester taking racist abuse. Because what she wanted to be able to show is that that's the lens through which her student experience is mitigated. So when we had students who did, we had a poetry slam. That was very good, I have to say. Quite anarchic poetry slam. I had I think it's in the thing, a camel milk ice cream seller. He made his own ice cream, sold it in the building. But we put on big shows of this. But again, the point of it was to say, your lived experience is a lens through which you experience being at university. Therefore, it has value. Therefore, here is a way where we're empowering you to use that as part of the learning journey. And it was incredibly powerful. And in fact, somebody said to me the other day that programme is still going at Manchester, and I'm very proud of it, I have to say. Other things that are on there, the big yellow thing in the middle is Kraftwerk. Yes, they are one of my favourite bands. That is why the project was called Kraftwerk. But that was about having a summer dedicated, effectively a boot camp for underemployed black students in the art school, so that we found a way of trying to lift up their opportunities by having this dedicated programme where they won internships and worked out in the city. And that, I have to say, was also excellent. I also supported them to do what was then called a BAME manifesto. Right? They had a series of challenging rights as an art installation in one of our key buildings. And all the senior teams came round to have a look at it because it was provocative. We did some quite radical things. The Home project was my induction project at Manchester Metropolitan, and that was about saying this is your new home, so let's get to know it. And it was involved going around, effectively doing treasure hunt, scavenger hunt things around Manchester. But again, one of my proudest moments in that, if you can see the Home project, that's Mike Gary, who's a performance poet, who quite famously released a poem to music about Tony Wilson, who was obviously behind the Hacienda and a lot of Manchester. And it draws in all the different cultural tropes. And he performed it with a 4-piece live orchestra in our building. And it was fabulous. And again, it's about how do you open up the cultural space in order to do things differently. There is some football on there. I was the director of the Centre for the Study of Football in its communities. We did a lot of work around asylum and refugee communities and how you could use football as a tool of integration. We created a toolkit for how football clubs could do that. And we ran a whole series of conferences on whether money had ruined the game through the Premier League. And also, I have to say, this was a time, I told you Manchester United would come back round. I gave up my season ticket and joined FC United of Manchester, which described itself as punk football. It was a community football. It was in opposition to the Glazer takeover of Manchester United. And it put on bands, and it did the cultural bit, and it had football. So there was a lot of work went on there, and as I said, it was really again about allowing people to use their lived experience to support their learning journey, and to give people the tools to advocate for themselves and for others. And for me, that was absolutely critical. I then didn't come straight to Staffordshire. I went via Nottingham Trent University, And again, I went there as Deputy Dean, again in social sciences. So by this point, and having come out of Manchester, I had the full portfolio for education. So I wasn't teaching politics anymore. I'd stepped out and I was looking across the piece in what were quite large faculties. These were faculties of sort of 12, 15,000 students. And at Nottingham and Trent, we did quite a lot of stuff around targeted support. And you can see, again, we did a student takeover of the magazine. We did an advocacy programme called Under the Success for All banner, where we were giving, again, people the ability to be able to speak up, to use student voice proactively in classrooms and in meetings where student union officers, who obviously were sat on committees, was to support them to be able to do that. So we had empowerment officers. And also then it was the pandemic, and that was very telling because obviously we did an evaluation of what had improved by understanding what had been the barriers to learning previously. So the ability of people to pace their work more so, to have different rules around assessment, if people remember that, to have different ways of learning that was more accessible and fit around different needs of their lives, then actually some of the metrics started to move in the right direction. And we thought, well, that's interesting. We also did an evaluation of what one of the key barriers was, and we found it was food poverty at Nottingham Trent, that one of the main barriers to students being able to learn was that they were in food poverty. And that was quite a shocking outcome for us. So we did work to ameliorate that. So that brings me to Staffordshire, and it brings me back to the West Midlands. So now as a Pro-Vice-Chancellor with a remit around student access and student success and student experience, I'm really proud of the pieces of work which try to still speak to the same underlying commitments that I outlined at the beginning, the importance and the transformative capacity of education and the ability to give voice or amplify voice to those who may be more excluded. And colleagues will be fed up with me talking about micro-credentials and lifelong learning, I know. But actually, that really is important. That's important work, because we're going back to the notion that flexibility, being able to learn and earn, or being able to stack your learning in order to get the learning that you need when you need it. And Len's here, but there's also, we've done quite a lot of work around student basic needs, the challenges of the cost of living crisis and the kind of barriers that's put up for people studying. I'm also very proud of the phenomenon-based learning, which is led by Sculp, which also reflects some of that real world. How do you democratise the classroom? How do you bring in real world learning in new and innovative ways? There's a lot of people from teams here. So I thank all the people that are here who have been absolutely engaged in this work and delivering, I still think is really important and is the core purpose, really, of higher learning. So you'll be pleased to know the last couple of things. So again, like I said, micro-credentials, lifelong learning, our provision overseas, some advocacy with the Department for Education, supporting colleagues who work on, who do a lot of work on addressing the attainment differentials. So I am myself proud of all the work of the colleagues in this and other areas, things like the Access and Participation Plan, things like the Teaching Excellence Framework, which now at least has a virtue of talking about educational gain, the pathways work that we do, the transitions work that we do, the work that we do with schools and colleges and the Multi-Academy Trust, the work that we do with employers, the work that we do with the Chamber and the councils, and that collectively we can have a positive impact on our city and region, because that is who we are, that's who Staffordshire University is, and that is our core purpose. So what have I learned since I had a football? That really the core remains the intersection of life and learning, and that we shouldn't undervalue what that means. The value of lived experience, because it mitigates the way in which people can absorb learning and their capacity to access learning. The importance of voice and how you apply that voice and knowledge in the appropriate context. Because actually, all of those things, if done well, can lead to better engagement, can lead to a better capacity. This is John Blake's kind of terminology, but the capacity to absorb learning that's on offer, can support with retention and progression. And like I said earlier, it's about not missing out on the opportunity that higher education can provide by helping to remove more of the barriers that might be in the way. And then it's about strategically now, for me, creating the opportunities and pathways that speak to that. So fundamentally, I still believe in the transformative capacity of higher education. This is the grandparents that I spoke about at the beginning. Really the transformational capacity of higher learning, and actually, to some extent, education for education's sake also. Because as Bell Hooks said in 1994, the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility. So we've got to grasp it, and we've got to get it right. And this university, and a university is only comprised of the people who are inside it, can be and should be the catalyst for change. And that's why I'm here, and that's why I lead this portfolio. And that's why I hope that I'm a Professor of Higher Education Leadership. If I'm allowed one small postscript, because my son is here, he's 14, Zeke, and I like to think he's carrying the torch. At 14, he's in a debating society. He's helped with the school newspaper. He likes a lot of music. Don't ask him to dance to Lady Gaga, please. But also, he set up the first politics society at his school recently. And for me, that means that it's carrying on to the next generation. The music, the politics, and the power of education. That's it. Thank you.
Annabelle, thank you for a transformational, I think, wonderful personal journey. You can take questions, you can say no, if you want to. It's not compulsory. If there are any questions to Annabelle, perhaps if I can ask the first one. I think there's a really important link, Annabelle. I know your dad's in the audience as well. I think there's a link between micro-credentials and the zine culture. Zine culture came out of situationalism. Jamie Reid that did all the Sex Pistols covers. It was French Marxism of seizing the everyday. And I think micro-credentials, interesting, radicalised are about seizing the everyday of learning, are they not? I think it's a really interesting link from where you started off as a learner, all the way through from your childhood to that new wave, punk way of learning. If you empower, if you were special advisor to Secretary of State and the shackles are off on micro-credentials, would there not be that zine culture that you started off with working with your parents, probably?
I think it's one of the reasons I'm keen on it, and it's why I bore colleagues endlessly about them, because I think they have absolutely that capacity. Because it is about learning at the right time, in the right size, with the right flexibility to create those kinds of pathways into education or work. And I've just written another piece, which I'm not plugging, but I've written another piece with a colleague from the Lifelong Learning group, Mary Mahoney, who I've said in that just imagine the possibilities if, for example, the Department for Work and Pensions, instead of the way in which the sanctions work now, but put people onto micro-credentials as a learning pathway, as opposed to all the straightforward ways in which people are sanctioned.
And I watched last night, as you know, the YouTube Gutter Snarp 27-minute piece that your father's in. Yep. And in that, it was really interesting. It's in language that's accessible, in stages that you progress at your own pace of reading.
Yes.
So it's a really, really interesting link.
Yes.
I didn't get it till I watched it. So
stuff.
I think I applaud your personal journey, but also sticking to your values and what you believe in. I think it's important in this neoliberal world we're in that you stand for something. Yep. I think it really came through in your talk. But anybody else want to ask anything? Your hand went up, Steve.
Yeah. Sorry, Stan. Great story. I really enjoyed that. And as a fan of the specials, selector, I was back in the moment, and I thank you for that. It was a very personal story, but I sense from what you were saying, I'd like you to say more about how you see us in terms of the broader policy and institutional changes, because from your own story, I sense some things have got better, but some things have got worse And I'd just like to know is what you see as the major challenges facing us if we're going to actually, advance social inclusion rather than constantly repeating the exclusions.
Yeah, it's a good point. Obviously, there are a lot of challenges in the sector. There are a lot of challenges broadly, and we're just part of that. We're part of that maelstrom. I think being able to retain the commitment to doing the right thing, as I would think of it, in terms of access, it's a resource model, right? Because you need to support people through. I don't think I think some things are better, right? And, my one hope of the lifelong learning entitlement, for example, is it brings us back into a place where there is the step-on, step-off approach to higher learning, that there are opportunities for people to learn across a lifetime, and it needs to pay off for people, but that does pay off in terms of their learning journey or their employment journey. I think overall, and I was talking to some other colleagues before, there are challenges in terms of the finance in the sector and the way in which we support programmes that are about widening access in the sector. And that does create challenges. And so you need to have a think about your strategic priorities. There are a lot of parts of our bit of the sector, if I can put it that way, the modern universities post-92s, who are about civic engagement, who are about making a difference in their place. And I think at Staffordshire that we have maintained that, and as with Martin as VC since start of 22, I think has been really clear about our mission to be able to deliver for the communities that surround us. And I think we have to hold on to that, and we need to think of the better and innovative ways that we can deliver it, given the challenges more broadly. But I don't underestimate what those challenges are, Steve. I should say that. And in some ways, it's easier when you're teaching because you can do your bit, isn't it? If you know what I mean, you can take your classroom, you can empower people in it and what have you. So my job now is to try and do that from a university perspective of creating those opportunities and those pathways in the best and most appropriate ways for people to get to not have their opportunities mitigated.
Any further questions to Annabelle? Jonathan? From our Board of Governors, Jonathan Chapman.
Fantastic today. The little girl with the football at the end. Wow, fantastic.
Thank you, Jonathan.
For me, I'm interested. Obviously, I've come from a commercial background, sort of from the city and so on, and I feel that we've let society down in terms of our role that we play in that. So you talked about the politics you showed. Is it I've forgotten the town, Telford?
Yeah.
And you said it's very similar today. So,
yes,
governments maybe not delivering, question mark.
Yeah.
Big society, the slogan, I like the slogan, I like the fact communities getting closer. I love the Metro Mayor concept.
Yes.
I see the power that that's having. Where does the commercial world fit into this? Because clearly government hasn't delivered. No criticism, it's a tough ask. Communities are fighting hard but struggling. Mm-hmm. Is there a third leg, a third way, a Tony Blair type thing around how we get commercial into this? Because that town needs reforming, as does Stoke, yes, as does where I'm from, Huddersfield as well. Yeah. What more could we do?
I think in a sort of old-fashioned way, I'm a fan of tripartism, right? So I think you get the best results when you engage all those stakeholders. And some of the work that we're doing currently, for example, and we're looking around Stoke and Staffordshire about how do you put together learning or training offers that suit the needs of this place and the people who live in it. And that has to be a joined-up piece of thinking and delivery between commercial, local government and education providers. And I think that does actually start to, if you can join that up and you can get the kind of the thinking right, then I do think that kind of tripartism is strong, because any time that you leave one of those legs off the stool, then you're fighting to keep it upright. And we do a lot of work with, and as you know, Jonathan, a lot of work with businesses, small businesses around. And actually, their challenges are quite similar to our challenges in terms of getting people through and out and successful in their business, and how do we help to train the generations of the future in order for the jobs of the future, that kind of thing. So we're engaged in the work collectively, but I do think that is the way forward. And your reference to Metro Mayors, because I do think something around devolution and the strength, putting some strength back into local government, and that probably means better devolution of budgets, would enable that. And I don't think we're quite there yet. And the big society tried to do that in a sort of a roundabout way, but didn't quite get there. But yeah, I think that's what we need, strength in all three.
So looking around the room, I think if we close the lecture, catalyst for change in action, I think is what we're seeing, Annabelle. Thank you for your long journey. Thank you for, I think, revealing a personal narrative through
Very
there
personal.
as well. And thank
There's
you
no
for
going
your,
back from that, is
thank
there?
you for your contribution to Staffordshire University. Final round of applause, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.